Meantime, our allies turning to China for cash. Countries like Japan and Australia now listing China as their #1 trading partner. And John Lee today is here to tell us why that might be a problem for us. He's a visiting fellow at the Hudson Institute, foreign policy fellow at the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, is also the author of the book, Will China Fail? Why do we care, or should we care, John, that Australia and countries like that are doing so much business with China? Why does it matter to us as Americans?
Yeah, it's pretty important. I'll tell you why. I mean, the foreign policy elites in these countries are still pretty solid behind America, but the business elites are becoming increasingly pro-Chinese. And in the future, if the Americans are forced to intervene militarily, say in the Taiwan Straits of South China Sea, it is not at all certain that these allies, and they've been allies for quite a few decades, that these allies will actually join on to an American military action. Now, this is the first time that this prospect is appearing for Washington, and it's something that you guys really have to look carefully at.
So that's interesting. So you're saying that given the choice between China and the United States, some of these countries in Asia and Southeast Asia would pick China right now?
Well, they may not necessarily pick China, but my worry and my suspicion is that they'll seek to stay on the sidelines, and that in itself weakens the American position in Asia, because America basically relies on its alliances and its allies to pick up some of the slack. So that's a real serious position for your country.
And not just politicians, but looking at some of the polling numbers that seem to show just regular people in Asia and Southeast Asia, in many cases, view the Chinese economy as more important than the U.S. economy. Now, when I read that, I could say, well, I wouldn't have been surprised if they said, well, in 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years it will be. But some people feel that way right now.
Yeah. If you look at the numbers, the U.S. economy is still much larger, and it's still a much more formidable economy. Sure. But I think these people are looking at the trends ahead. They're looking at the current domestic economic problems that America has, and they're looking at Chinese growth, which is 10-11%. Now, China's actually a lot weaker than most people believe, but the perception, and perceptions are important, the perception is that America's declining and China's rising. That's the topic of your book, right? Will China fail? So, I mean, simply, will it? Well, the thing about China is that, you know, we see the state sector in China. We see a very strong, rich government in China doing all sorts of things. But we don't realize that the vast majority of China, the private sector in China, for example, is extremely poor and extremely weak. So China is a strong state, weak country. Now, that kind of combination, if you look at history, tends to be quite unstable. But what that means, though, is that Beijing as a government has a lot of resources to play with.
Yes, they do, and they're just so big, and the scale of China being so much larger than any other country has to give them some sort of an advantage. What do we do then as Americans, just to kind of wrap this up and finish it with you, John? How do we change this dynamic that seems to be shifting in their favor? They seem to hold a lot of the cards here.
Yeah, Americans can do a couple of things. First, Asia has always looked to America for two things, security and trade. You guys, the current administration doesn't seem to have a trade policy, so that's a real arm tied behind your back. The second thing is there almost seems to be some sort of embarrassment about America being a democracy. Now, on the contrary, that shouldn't be the case. The 60 years of prosperity in Asia has depended on a dominant democracy offering public goods in Asia. China can't do that, America can. So you've really got to push your democratic credentials in the region.
Push them a little bit harder. Makes sense, John. Thank you for your time today. China's becoming a big election issue, too, heading up to tomorrow. John, thanks for coming on. John Lee. Dig it.
My pleasure.